set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him. And she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ. In the name of God who loves us and calls us to respond. Amen. Please be seated. Ephphatha. What did you say, Jesus? F what? Ephphatha? Jesus, please, don't go around saying the F word. What are you saying? All right, if you got a little worried for a minute, I want you to pay attention to that. I'm going to come back to Ephphatha later in the sermon. But I get the sense that as we read the Gospels sometimes, most of us read the Gospels through the lens of Jesus' divinity, through the lens of his uniqueness as the very presence of God here on earth, the Son of God. Joanna Siebert tells the story of taking this concept to the absurd. She says, we read the gospel sometimes as though Jesus just can't wait to tell everybody that the earth actually revolves around the sun. And the magic of a Hot Pocket when the microwave goes ding and it's time to eat. But today we see a little different Jesus. We see a Jesus who is weary and tired, and we know a Jesus who often takes time away, takes time in solitude and in prayer to renew his spirit, his connection with his Father God. And on this instance, his effort at getting away is disrupted. It's disrupted by a woman who shows up and invades this time of his, desperate for the healing of her daughter. Now, if this were a Hebrew woman, already we'd be in trouble. For a Hebrew woman accompanied by a man in the first century to speak to a Hebrew man, a Jewish man, and not only a Jewish man, but a rabbinical teacher. Forbidden. Not possible. You might as well have a homeless man walk into a state dinner. Further, she's not a Jewish woman. She is Greek, and her ancestry is Syro-Phoenician. Strike 2. Strike 3, you're out. Why are you here? Why are you here? What is this woman doing here? But perhaps the way we've heard this sermon preached, we're not so concerned with the woman, but we're more concerned with who? With what Jesus says. We're worried about maybe the F word and the ephatha and stuff that we aren't as familiar with, but what does Jesus call this woman? Go ahead, say it, it's okay. What does Jesus call this woman? From over here? A dog. A dog. What? What? I've got a parable for us. It's a parable about entering heaven. It's in the first person voice. I invite you to close your eyes because the parable's about a dream. So close your eyes. The other day I had a dream. I dreamed I arrived at the gates of heaven. Heavy shut, pure oak, beveled and crafted, glinting sharp in the sunlight. St. Peter stood to greet me. The big man wore a brown smile set deep against his ruddy cheeks. "You're here," he said. "I am," I said. "Great to see you. Been expecting you," he smiled. "Come on in." He gently pushed against the huge door. It swung silently, creakless. I took a couple of steps forward until, at the threshold, one more step up and in, I realized I wasn't alone. My friends seemed to have joined me, but they hovered behind, silent, looking on. None spoke. I realized only I could speak. These were friends from where I grew up, my neighborhood, from my school and my work, all across my life. I looked at them. Some, of course, were Christians. Some also Hindus and Buddhists, some Muslims, some Jews, some atheists, some God knows what. I stopped and paused. A hesitant St. Peter looked at me patiently, expectantly. "What about these guys?" I asked him. "My friends. Can they come?" "Well, Phil," he replied, soft in the still air, "you know the rules. I'm sorry, but that's the way things are. Only the right ones." I looked at him. It was as if he was genuinely pained by his answer. I stood considering, what should I do? I thought about my reference points for faith. I thought about the gospel. I thought about Jesus. Jesus and the outsider. Jesus and the bastard. Jesus and the unacceptable. The drunkard, the fool, the heretic, the criminal. And I knew exactly where I belonged. "I'll just stay here too then," I said, taking my one foot and pulling it back across the threshold. And I'll tell you, I swear, as I turned, I saw something like a grin break across St. Peter's face. And a voice from inside whispered, "At last. At last." Does anyone have ears to listen? Does anyone have ears to listen? I pull this parable out because it turns on its head what it means for us to enter the joy of our Master, to enter what we might consider the kingdom of God. The takeaway from the parable is that just as this person thinks he's beginning to enter heaven, he realizes that it's been there with him throughout his entire life. You've heard me preach before. It comes as no surprise to you that the gospel we have received and been formed in for much of our lives speaks to us of a heaven that exists upon our death, an escape plan to some other place out there when we die. But as I will also remind you, if you keep reading to the end of the story, that place out there seems to have been here, where God comes on the cloud to make God's home among mortals. Many people think about what Jesus says today in the gospel, and they expect the preacher to come up, and they hope that the preacher will save Jesus from his own words. Calling a woman a dog, Jesus? Come on. It's the idiom of the day. There are layers of tension in those words. But I don't want to save Jesus today. I don't think that's my job. I think Jesus is a big boy and will stand in his whole gospel. I do want us to learn, though, from someone else in the story. Someone who Jesus himself learned from. Jesus, who knew about the microwave oven and the hot pockets and the sun and the earth, who in Luke's gospel says that he grew in wisdom and stature. And this story is one in which I think he grew in wisdom and stature. He confronts this woman and is confronted by this woman. And she responds to him in a most unexpected way. And I think she teaches us how to respond in most unexpected ways. So a question for you. When I talked at the beginning of the sermon, when I opened with the F thing and the F word and stuff, did you kind of get lost my battery? Can you help me with that? Did you kind of get confused for a moment? Did the hair on the back of your neck start getting raised just a little bit? Because I was talking about something that would be offensive. Where is he going to go there? What is Father Nick doing? Okay, pay attention to that. That is how we respond to things that are offensive to us. You saving me, Jordan? Oh. That is how we respond to things that are offensive to us. We race in our fear so fast that your mind has to catch up with what's actually being said. What we begin to know is that we've been offended. Gonna try this. Okay. What we begin to know is that we have been offended. And in the milliseconds of what happens, that's all that matters. The rest of our brain, the more complex part, the developed parts, the human parts up here, we haven't even figured out yet what has happened. We have to re-narrate it to ourselves. Wait, what is he saying? What does he mean by that? What is that? And we panic. Notice how, though, this Syrophoenician woman doesn't do that. Jesus says words that are quite offensive. And yet, just like in the parable, she turns over the table. She completely lets us into a world that we don't even think about, one that is underneath the table. And she makes a claim that there at this table, she and her daughter can also belong. And notice she does this by not rejecting Jesus, but by making room in what he himself has said for her place and the healing of her daughter. What we learn from this woman, what she teaches us, straight to the point, is what we so often fail to do in our offense. She teaches us that in order for her story to be a better one, no one else's story has to be worse. In order for her daughter to be healed, no one else's story has to be worse. And when we're offended, we fear and we worry that it will turn out less than. We seek, when we're scared, to preserve status quo. In this teaching, it is the Syrophoenician woman who becomes our model. And thank God. Because what you probably do not know is that when she goes to Jesus and says these words back to him, not out of offense, but out of affirmation, she is there pleading for you and for me. You see, at this point in the gospel, Jesus has not interacted, healed, come across, or given his mission to anybody except for the Jewish people. At this point in Mark's gospel, we don't have an experience of Jesus' expanded mission. This expanded mission that, by the way, at the end of Mark's gospel will have us hear the words, "Go ye into all the world and preach the good news." This Syrophoenician woman, in some sense, is our own spiritual mother, who stands there with Jesus in the tension and the difference, and takes a risk that he is the one whom she has heard about, and when she makes that claim to him, he will realize who he already is: the Son of God, giving his life as he will do for the world. Jesus, of course, heals her daughter, goes on down to the region by Decapolis and finds a mute deaf, not hesitating for a moment, but pulling him aside and saying the prayers in a most intimate way that will release his hearing and his tongue. Oh, to those who have ears to hear. What this woman is teaching us is that for all the tension and the difference that our humanity and our human family has, for all of the stress that comes with living together in that difference, we have no need in the gospel to other any other person or group. There's already enough that we have to figure out in our own unique, created belovedness, in the accidents of a sinful history in which tribe has built up against tribe. We have enough to figure out if we are to make our way into the family of God together without separating and othering. Because what happens when we are offended is that we build a wall to separate and protect ourselves so that we cannot be harmed, so that we don't have to change. This woman, by staying with this tension, changes the course for her daughter and asks us to see ourselves as her daughters and sons, brought into this larger and better story that each time someone is brought into doesn't mean anything less for the rest of us, but always points to welcome, always points to good news. Richard Rohr, Franciscan and author, says that the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. I believe that we have a great gift. I have a great opportunity here. Unique perhaps among churches, not in the world, but in this town. We bear our truth. We worship God. We serve in the power of the Spirit as two congregations in one place. Episcopalian and Lutheran, side by side. An opportunity to practice the better is right here with us and in front of us. By God, there are differences in our traditions, differences in our cultures, differences in how we use this word or that in our worship. But to live together, standing together to praise the one God that we both serve. How much more of a message of the gospel could that ring out to this city, to the neighborhoods and the workplaces, to the spheres of our influence and the places we know? I'm here almost a year, and you've shown me how we can do that. Not ignoring or forgetting in any parts of our lives difficulty or difference, but how it is that we feast together, get our hands dirty together, whether it's building a playground that will be climbed upon by all children, or whether it's serving a meal that will be eaten by one of God's own children, not in our flock. May we be brave like this Syrophoenician woman. May we see in her a spiritual mother and a teacher who is out there advocating for us to be included. And as we grow and mature in our faith, may we become her, standing in the tension, always there for the children not yet included, making the case and risking that the one we've heard about, this Jesus, is who he really is. The gospel. Good news. May we have ears to hear. May we have the word to speak. Ephphatha.